In the freezing cold of a Montana winter night, no one should be outside at that time. A girl clutched a puppy tightly in her arms, refusing to let go. No one knew why she was there. Not far away, a former Navy SEAL K-9 and his loyal dog were on their daily duty. A faint cry, piercing the icy night, felt like a knife to his heart, a familiar sound of someone desperately calling for help. What happens next will show us that sometimes saving someone else is also saving yourself. Before we begin, please let me know where you're watching from. Subscribe for more. Snow fell in heavy whispering sheets over the Montana wilderness, swallowing the forest in a pale, soundless haze. Wind howled like a restless ghost through the pines, scattering drifts across the frozen trail where a man and his dog moved. Steady, deliberate, the kind of rhythm born from years of discipline and solitude. Ethan Cole adjusted the strap of his backpack, the beam of his headlamp cutting through the storm like a blade. A former Navy SEAL K-9 handler, 35, his frame was lean but built from endurance rather than vanity, muscle hardened by miles of marching and winters spent alone. His face carried the rugged map of a man who had seen both battlefields and empty nights. Sharp jawline shadowed by a few days of stubble, storm-gray eyes always scanning, never still. His brown hair was short, practical, and dusted now with snow. Years ago he had been easy-spoken, known for dry humor and a calm confidence under fire. But that was before the explosion in Kandahar, before he dragged his wounded dog out of the dust and left his best friend buried beneath it. Now silence had become both shield and punishment. Beside him trotted Ranger, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a dark sable coat streaked by a faint scar across his left shoulder, the same scar that had once mirrored Ethan's own shrapnel wound. The dog moved with silent precision, head low, eyes sharp amber, reading the landscape with a soldier's instinct. Ranger had once been decorated for saving lives on foreign soil. These days, he was Ethan's only partner, the only heartbeat he trusted. The beam of the headlamp swept across snow-laden trees and vanished into mist. Then came a sound, thin, distant, human. Not the moan of wind or the groan of bending pines, but a broken cry carried on the blizzard. Ethan froze, his pulse quickening. Ranger lifted his head, ears rigid, growl buried deep in his chest. "Easy," Ethan muttered, voice rough from disuse. He clicked his flashlight to high beam, scanning the white expanse. The sound came again, a faint, desperate sob. He followed it, pushing through knee-deep drifts, breath-forming clouds in the freezing air. Within minutes, the outline of a vehicle appeared through the storm. A dark pickup half buried in snow, driver's door hanging open, engine still faintly ticking. He approached cautiously, his military instincts whispering every possible threat. "U.S. Ranger Service," he called, out of habit more than hope. No response. He moved closer, weapon hand steady but low, while Ranger sniffed around the vehicle, tail stiff. The smell of antifreeze and fear hung in the air. Ethan aimed the flashlight into the back seat and stopped. Curled in the shadows was a young woman, clutching a small, motionless bundle to her chest. "Hey!" Ethan's voice cut through the wind as he pulled the door open. The woman flinched, her lips cracked, face ghost-pale against the dark interior. Snowflakes clung to her lashes. She couldn't have been more than 24. Her figure was slender, fragile beneath a torn winter coat, not built for the cold. Long hair, once chestnut, now damp and tangled, fell around a face that had been pretty before exhaustion carved its edges. Her skin was pale as frost, lips blue, eyes wide and glassy with shock. "Don't move," Ethan said gently, checking her pulse with gloved fingers. "Weak, but there. You're okay. I've got you." Her arms tightened around the small shape she was holding, a German shepherd puppy, maybe 3 months old, shivering violently in a thin towel. The pup's fur was soaked, tan and black, mottled with ice, its tiny paws twitching. "Is he alive?" the woman gasped, voice barely audible over the wind. Ethan pressed his fingers to the pup's ribs. "He's breathing, just cold." Her head fell back against the seat, a tear freezing halfway down her cheek. Thank God. He noticed the car's heater was dead, dashboard lights dim. Whoever she was, she'd been out here too long. Ethan grabbed his thermal blanket, wrapping it around her and the puppy, then retrieved an oxygen canister from his pack. "Breathe slow," he ordered, fitting the mask gently over her mouth. She obeyed without question, eyes never leaving the dog. "What's your name?" "Clara," she whispered through the mask. "Clara Bennett." He nodded. "Ethan, you're lucky I was nearby." Her eyes flickered toward the empty road behind him. There was no road, only snow. "Lucky," she repeated faintly. "I don't believe in luck anymore." When he looked closer, he saw bruises along her wrists, faint but deliberate. Her fingernails were torn, like she'd fought someone. The pieces started fitting together, the kind of ugliness that had nothing to do with weather. "Anyone else with you?" She shook her head. "He left us." Ethan's voice lowered. "Who?" "My father." The words barely formed, breaking mid-sentence. "He said, if I cared so much about that dog, I could die with it." Ethan felt the slow, familiar rise of anger, the kind he'd learned to control, but never erase. He didn't ask more. There would be time for that later, if she survived the night. He worked fast. Ranger circled the truck, then barked once, impatient, the way he did when he sensed trouble. Ethan lifted Clara out, cradling the puppy between them. She was light, almost weightless in his arms, skin like ice through her coat. He moved through the blizzard with practiced precision, following Ranger's tracks toward the faint outline of a cabin through the trees, a dark smudge of safety against the storm. By the time they reached it, Ethan's breath came in sharp bursts, lashes crusted with ice. He shouldered open the door, warm air and wood smoke rushing to meet them. Inside, the single-room cabin glowed dimly from a fire, burning in a stone hearth. He laid Clara on the couch, stripping off her wet coat, covering her with thick wool blankets. The puppy he set near the hearth, wrapping it in another layer and rubbing its sides to stimulate blood flow. Ranger stood nearby, tail twitching, his golden eyes never leaving the stranger's. Ethan checked Clara's temperature, dangerously low but climbing. He fed her sips of warm water, her breathing steadied. The puppy gave a weak whimper, then another, stronger this time. Ethan smiled despite himself. "Tough little guy." Clara's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then finding him. "Where am I?" "My cabin," he said simply. "You'll be fine. I've seen worse." "Are you military?" "Was," Ethan replied. "Now I just help whoever gets lost out here." She hesitated, gaze softening as she looked around the rustic room. Maps on the walls, a weather radio, framed photographs of a younger Ethan with a squad of soldiers and dogs. "You live alone?" "Me and him," Ethan nodded toward Ranger. The dog's ears perked. Clara stared at him. "He's beautiful." "Best soldier I ever had," Ethan said quietly. "Still is." For a moment the only sound was the fire crackling, the wind clawing faintly at the windows. Clara's eyes drifted to the puppy curled near the flames. "His name's Milo," she whispered. "I found him in a cage. He was so small. I couldn't leave him there." Ethan's brow furrowed. "Cage. My father's company tests drugs on animals." Her voice shook, but the oxygen mask steadied her breath. I tried to stop it, took one out. He said I ruined him, that I wasn't his daughter anymore. Ethan didn't answer. Words like that, betrayal, exile, carried weight he understood too well. He remembered the orders that had cost his team their lives, the military tribunal that had stripped him of his insignia, the way the world had quietly turned its back. He remembered standing in the cold afterward, thinking maybe he deserved it. Now this stranger sat before his fire, carrying her own kind of exile. Clara's fingers brushed the puppy's head. I thought if I could get away, maybe someone would believe me. But when the truck stopped, her voice cracked, I knew he meant for it to stop. Ethan adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, avoiding her eyes. You're safe now. Her gaze lifted, searching his face for truth. Why help me? You don't even know me. He paused, hand resting on the edge of the couch. Because once, someone saved me when they didn't have to. Outside, the storm screamed against the cabin walls, snow piling higher against the windowsills. Inside, the small fire grew brighter, fighting back the cold. Ranger settled near the door, head on his paws, but eyes still open, sentinel of a fragile peace. Clara's breathing slowed. Exhaustion claimed her. She murmured something as she drifted toward sleep, words Ethan barely caught. My father wants me gone. Ethan looked toward the window, where the night pressed against the glass like a living thing. He said nothing. He just added another log to the fire. Ranger lifted his head, gaze fixed on the woman and the puppy, then on his master. His ears twitched once, a silent question, a soldier waiting for orders. Ethan gave a quiet nod. Watch them, he murmured. The dog shifted position, lying between the couch and the door, muscles coiled, eyes unblinking. Outside, the wind howled louder, but within the cabin the world seemed to narrow into warmth, breath, and faint heartbeat. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt something move beneath the armor of his silence, a sense that maybe, just maybe, this night wasn't another reminder of what he'd lost, but the fragile beginning of something worth protecting again. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving the forest wrapped in a cold, crystalline stillness. Frost glittered on the window panes of the cabin like shards of broken glass. The fire had burned low, casting long amber shadows across the rough-hewn floorboards. Ethan Cole stood by the window, one hand resting on the frame, his breath fogging the glass as he stared at the pale horizon. The silence after a blizzard was always strange, too perfect, too still, like the world was holding its breath. He turned slightly, eyes catching the faint movement on the couch. Clara Bennett stirred beneath the heavy blanket, lashes fluttering open. Her face was still colorless, but softer now in the morning light. The warmth from the hearth had brought life back to her cheeks, and her chestnut hair, tangled and dry, framed her face like the edges of an old photograph. She blinked slowly, as if waking from a dream that had taken too much of her strength. The puppy, Milo, slept curled in a ball beside her, tiny chest rising and falling beneath the wool. Ethan poured hot water into a chipped mug, dropped in a tea bag, and crouched beside her. You should drink this. It'll help. Clara took it with trembling fingers, the steam fogging her face. You saved us. Ethan shrugged as if the act meant nothing. Ranger found you. He deserves the thanks. The German shepherd lifted his head from near the fire, ears twitching, eyes gleaming gold in the dimness. Clara smiled weakly, her voice small. Thank you, Ranger. The dog stared at her for a moment, then laid his head back down with a low sigh. For a while, They sat in silence. The fire crackled softly. Outside, a branch snapped under the weight of snow. Clara watched Ethan with cautious curiosity. There was something in his stillness, a weight, an invisible gravity that drew her attention. His movements were precise, controlled, like a man who had learned long ago that hesitation could kill. She finally spoke. "You were military." Ethan didn't answer right away. He sat on the edge of the wooden table, rubbing his thumb over a dent in the surface, as if it were an old wound. "Yeah, Navy SEAL K-9 unit, a long time ago." "What happened?" He gave a short breath through his nose, something between a laugh and a sigh. "My team followed orders that shouldn't have been followed. We lost 3 men. Ranger almost didn't make it. I was blamed for questioning command after it was too late. They said I lost control." His eyes found the dog, softer now. "Truth is, I did, but not in the way they thought." Clara lowered her gaze. "You tried to save them. Didn't matter. Command needed a scapegoat." He poured himself coffee, black and strong, the smell filling the room. "After that I came here, easier to fight weather than people." She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. "You sound like someone who's still fighting." Ethan glanced toward her, half a smile tugging his lips. "Aren't we all?" Her smile faltered. "I guess so." He leaned back in the chair, studying her. "You want to tell me why your father left you out there?" Clara stared into the fire. The orange light flickered across her face, catching the glint of a tear before it fell. "I worked for him," she began quietly. "For Bennett Labs. I was supposed to manage medical data, clinical reports, animal studies, nothing dangerous." She swallowed hard. "But then I found out what they were testing. Not medicine, nerve agents, disguised as pharmaceutical compounds. They were using dogs, hundreds of them, burning their skin, forcing injections. I tried to report it. Nobody listened, so I filmed it myself." Ethan's fingers tightened around his mug. "You went against your own father?" He stopped being a father the moment profit meant more than life. Her voice trembled, then hardened. "When he found out what I'd done, he took my phone, locked me in our estate's basement, said he'd figure out what to do with me. Yesterday he said he wanted to talk, drove me out to the mountains. When the car stopped, he just told me to get out." She stared into the fire, and the reflection of the flames flickered in her eyes. "He drove away while I was still holding Milo. I screamed until my throat bled." Ethan said nothing. His jaw flexed once, the muscle ticking under the skin. The silence was thick enough to suffocate. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, rough-edged. "He's going to pay for that." Clara shook her head weakly. "You don't know him. Richard Bennett isn't just powerful. He owns half the pharmaceutical networks in this state. He's untouchable." Ethan took a long sip of coffee. "Everyone's touchable," Ranger growled softly, eyes shifting to the window. Ethan followed his gaze and frowned. Outside, the pale light glinted off a line of fresh tracks leading down the slope, too straight to be from deer. He moved closer to the window, peering through the glass. The tracks vanished into the trees. He turned back to Clara. "You didn't have anyone following you?" Her brow furrowed. "No. He took my phone. I don't think anyone even knows I'm alive." Ethan nodded, though unease lingered in his gut. "Eat something," he said. "You'll need strength." He warmed a can of soup, placed it beside her, and checked Milo again. The pup was awake now, licking her fingers, tail thumping faintly. The sight softened the edge in Ethan's chest. Clara smiled through her exhaustion. "He likes you," she said as Ranger came closer, sniffing Milo curiously. The contrast between the massive adult dog and the trembling puppy was oddly tender. Ranger doesn't like anyone, Ethan replied. Maybe he sees something familiar. Another survivor? She asked. He gave a small nod. Something like that. As the day stretched into afternoon, Ethan worked on repairing the satellite radio mounted on the shelf. Clara sat wrapped in a blanket, watching him, feeling both gratitude and confusion. He was kind in a way that didn't draw attention to itself. Efficient, quiet, almost reluctant. She sensed that helping her reopened something inside him, something he didn't want to face. When she spoke again, her voice was gentle. "You ever think about going back? To the military, I mean?" Ethan tightened a screw, not looking up. "You can't go back to something that already buried you?" The words hung heavy between them. As dusk approached, the temperature began to drop again. Ethan stacked more logs by the hearth, then fetched his rifle from its mount by the door. Clara's eyes widened slightly. "Protection," he said. "We get strays sometimes, wolves, coyotes, or worse." "Worse," she echoed. "People." Outside, the wind began to rise again, faint howls threading through the trees. Ranger stood by the door, tense but silent. Ethan checked the latch and moved a wooden bar into place. Clara's voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you think he'll come looking for me?" Ethan studied the flames for a long moment. "Men like your father don't look back," he said. "They send someone else to do it for them." Her hands tightened around the blanket. "Then we should leave, right? Go to the police." "The sheriff's office is 50 miles east. Roads are still buried under 6 feet of snow. No signal. We'd freeze before we got halfway." Clara's breath shuddered. "So, we're trapped." "Safe," he corrected. "For now." Ranger's ears twitched again. The dog padded to the window, a low rumble in his throat. Ethan joined him and caught a glimpse of a shadow moving between the trees, a flicker too quick to define. He stayed still, watching until the forest returned to silence. When he turned back, Clara was watching him closely, fear flickering in her eyes. "It's nothing," he said, though his instincts disagreed. She tried to smile, but failed. "You don't lie well." He allowed a faint grin. "Didn't say I was trying." The tension eased for a heartbeat. The firelight flickered between them, warm and fragile. Clara reached down, touching Milo's paw. "I used to think I understood people," she said softly. "I thought if you showed kindness, they'd show it back. I was wrong." Ethan's voice was quiet. "You weren't wrong. You just trusted the wrong people." Her eyes met his. "And you?" "I trusted the right ones. They just didn't make it." The words slipped into the quiet like stones sinking into deep water. Later, as night folded around the cabin again, Clara lay on the couch with Milo pressed to her chest. Ethan sat near the window, rifle across his lap, watching the tree line through the darkness. Ranger rested at his feet, eyes half closed but alert. When Ethan glanced back, he saw Clara asleep, the faintest smile on her lips. Milo's paw was draped over her wrist, a soft, unintentional gesture of faith. For a man who had spent years believing he'd lost every reason to care, the sight did something strange inside him, like the slow thawing of ice, too long frozen. Outside, the moon broke through the clouds for a moment, silvering the snow-covered forest. Ethan watched it in silence. The ghosts of what he'd lost still lingered, but for the first time, he wondered if they might finally stop haunting him. By the second morning, the storm had settled into a quiet that felt unnatural. The forest seemed to be listening. Snow lay deep and untouched, except for one trail of prints leading to Ethan's cabin, and another, faint but fresh, circling it like a ghost that had changed its mind. Ethan Cole crouched beside the marks, one gloved hand brushing the snow. The imprints were too wide, too deliberate. Boots, not from a hiker or ranger. Someone had been watching the cabin while they slept. Behind him, Clara stood wrapped in Ethan's spare jacket, her breath fogging in the brittle air. "Animal tracks?" she asked, though her voice betrayed the hope that they were. He shook his head slowly. "Human. 2, maybe 3. Heavy tread, probably carrying weight. They came from the ridge." Clara's fingers tightened on the blanket she held around herself. Milo peeked from under her arm, small nose twitching. The pup let out a soft whine as if sensing the unease that had settled over his rescuers. Ranger paced beside Ethan, hackles rising, nose low to the ground. His amber eyes flicked toward the trees, reading something only instinct could see. Ethan rose, his breath clouding. They know someone's up here. Inside the cabin, he packed supplies with mechanical precision, thermal blankets, rations, ammo. Clara tried to help, but he stopped her with a gesture. "We move light. Take only what keeps you alive." She nodded, slipping the blanket around Milo like a sling. "Where will we go?" "North," Ethan said. "There's a ridge trail that crosses the frozen river. We can reach Tom Whitaker's place before nightfall, if the weather holds." "Tom?" "Old unit mate," Ethan replied. "Lives off-grid near the reserve, knows how to stay invisible." He looked at her directly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Once we leave, we don't come back." Clara hesitated, glancing toward the warm cabin that had briefly felt like safety. But when Ranger barked once, sharp, alert, she nodded. They left before sunrise, moving through the skeletal forest beneath a sky washed pale with frost. Ethan led, rifle slung tight against his back, scanning constantly. Ranger padded ahead, silent and sure-footed, breaking a narrow path through drifts. Clara followed, clutching Milo close, the pup's breath warm against her chest. The trek was brutal. The wind cut like a blade, carrying ice so fine it felt like glass against skin. Clara stumbled more than once, but Ethan's hand was always there, steady and wordless. He didn't speak unless necessary. His silence was protective, not cold. By midday, they reached the frozen expanse of Lake Morin, a vast white mirror stretching to the mountains. The ice groaned beneath each cautious step, the sound echoing into emptiness. Clara stared across it, shivering. "Is it safe?" Ethan tested the surface with the barrel of his rifle, listening. "Safer than the woods behind us." As they crossed, the wind rose, carrying with it the distant hum of an engine. Ethan stopped. The sound was faint but real. A snowmobile somewhere far down the valley. His jaw tightened. "They're using machines. That means they've got coordinates." Clara's heart clenched. "They're coming?" "Not yet, but they will." He motioned for her to move faster. They pushed forward. Ranger stayed at the front, occasionally turning his head, giving a low, vibrating bark, his version of a warning. The dog's paws left clean, deliberate marks across the snow, each one a guidepost of survival. By the time they reached the far bank, the wind was roaring. Clara collapsed to her knees, gasping. Ethan knelt beside her, his face flushed from the cold. "You good?" She nodded, though her voice broke. "I'm trying." "I know." He helped her up, wrapping a scarf tighter around her face. "You're doing fine." They climbed into the tree line where the wind softened. The forest here was older, darker. The snow fell through high branches in whispering flurries. It was there, among the shadows, that Ethan finally spoke again, his tone softer, almost distant. "You asked me once why I left the SEALs." Clara looked up at him, her breath catching on the cold air. "I had a partner," he said, eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "Sergeant Mike Reyes. He was the kind of man who believed you could fix the world if you just held on long enough. We were ambushed during an evac. Command told us to hold position. I knew it was suicide. Mike stayed anyway, said the others needed time to fall back." Ethan's jaw flexed. He was still talking when the mortar hit. He stopped walking, hands clenched around his gloves. "When I got back to base, Ranger wouldn't eat for 3 days. We both carried that scar ever since." Clara's voice was gentle. "That's why you stayed here. Because of him." Ethan exhaled, the sound thin and sharp. "Because I couldn't save him." They walked in silence after that. Milo wriggled slightly in Clara's arms, licking her chin, pulling her back to the moment. She looked at Ethan's back, broad, steady, framed against the snow, and felt something unspoken tighten in her chest. By dusk, they reached the first sign of civilization, a smoke trail curling above the ridge. The log house appeared between firs, half buried in snow, with a stack of chopped wood piled high by the porch. Ethan motioned for Clara to stay back and approached carefully. The front door creaked open before he could knock. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, maybe in his 60s, but built like the forest itself, solid, weathered, impossible to move. His beard was iron gray, trimmed but rugged, and his eyes were blue, clear, assessing, sharp. He wore a thick wool coat and held an old rifle casually across his chest, not aiming, but ready. "Cole?" the man said after a moment, his voice gravelly, tinged with surprise. "I'll be damned." Ethan allowed a rare smile. "Tom Whitaker. Still alive, I see." "Barely," Tom said, lowering the rifle. He glanced toward Clara and the puppy. "You pick up strays now?" "Something like that," Ethan replied. Tom looked again at the girl, noting her trembling hands, her pale, wind-burned cheeks. Beneath his gruff exterior, there was compassion buried deep, a trace of the lawman he used to be. "Get inside before you freeze solid." The cabin was larger than Ethan's, lined with old trophies, tools, and the faint scent of cedar. Tom poured coffee while Ethan explained in short, clipped sentences. Richard Bennett, the betrayal, the men disguised as hunters. Tom listened without interruption, his expression hardening. "Figures. I've seen that kind before. Money makes people think winter won't bite them." He set his mug down with a thud. "You can stay tonight, maybe tomorrow, but if those bastards are tracking you, you'll need to move again." Clara's voice trembled. "How can they find us out here?" Tom scratched his beard. "Satellite ping, drone sweeps, maybe just luck. Doesn't take much these days." His eyes softened slightly. "You did good coming here. We'll keep you safe for now." Ranger trotted toward the door, sniffing the threshold, tail stiff. Tom watched him approvingly. "Fine animal. Reminds me of my old K9, Duke. Lost him 10 winters ago." "He's family," Ethan said simply. They ate what Tom could offer, stew thick with venison, steaming bread. The warmth eased the stiffness from Clara's fingers. For the first time in days, color returned to her face. She watched the two men, so different yet bound by the same weary understanding, and felt an almost forgotten feeling stir inside her. Safety. But that illusion cracked when Ranger suddenly rose, ears snapping forward. The low growl that rumbled from his chest silenced the room. Ethan stood immediately, eyes narrowing. "What is it?" Clara whispered. Ranger barked once, sharp and urgent. Tom crossed to the window, pulled aside the curtain. "Snowmobiles," he said flatly. "3 of them, coming up the ridge." Ethan's pulse quickened. "They found us." Tom grabbed his rifle and threw Ethan a look that belonged to another lifetime. "Then we remind them the mountain still bites." Outside, the wind began to rise again, swirling snow through the darkening trees. Clara held Milo close, eyes wide with fear. Ethan chambered around, steady and calm. Ranger stood beside him, every muscle taut, eyes glowing like twin embers. The peace of the mountains was gone. The hunt had begun. The mountain storm arrived with no warning, an avalanche of wind and snow, swallowing the world in white. The forest roared as if alive, trees bending under invisible hands. Ethan Cole tightened his parka around his neck, eyes narrowed against the blinding flurry. His breath froze instantly in the air. Behind him, Clara stumbled through knee-deep snow, clutching the trembling puppy against her chest. Tom Whitaker followed last, his broad frame bowed against the gale, carrying his rifle across his back. Ranger stayed ahead of them all, his dark coat nearly blending into the storm, only the flicker of amber eyes showing where he was. They were losing daylight fast. The wind howled over the ridge, carrying the bitter song of the mountains. Ethan shouted over the storm, "Raven's Hollow's close! Keep moving!" His voice was almost swallowed by the wind. Raven's Hollow was an ancient cave carved into the northern face of the mountain, a scar of black stone where miners once dug for silver. Ethan had found it years ago during a rescue mission. Now it was their last hope of shelter. When they reached the entrance, the snow was so thick it clung to their eyelashes. Ethan dragged Clara inside first, then Tom, who immediately began to build a fire near the rocky wall. Ranger shook himself off, scattering snow in all directions, and padded toward the cave mouth, his tail stiff and ears twitching. The cave smelled of damp stone and old earth. It was narrow at first, then widened into a dome-shaped chamber. Shadows stretched long under the flickering light of Ethan's headlamp. The air inside was warmer, though still cold enough to see every breath. Clara sank beside the fire, cradling Milo. Her face was pale and raw from the wind. "How long do we have to stay here?" "Until it passes," Ethan said, dropping his pack. "Maybe a few hours, maybe the night." Tom glanced toward the entrance. "They won't stop just because of weather. Men like that keep moving." Ethan nodded grimly. "That's what I'm counting on." While Tom cooked a pot of coffee over the fire, Ethan began checking their supplies. As he pulled out Clara's backpack to redistribute weight, something small and metallic fell from the side pocket, clinking against the cave floor. It rolled toward the light. Ranger snapped his head toward it, growling softly. Ethan crouched, picked it up. A black transmitter, no bigger than a coin, blinking faintly red. His stomach tightened. "Damn it," he muttered. Tom frowned. "What is it?" "GPS tracker," Ethan said. "Low frequency, military grade." Clara's voice trembled. I didn't even know it was there." Ethan looked at her, not with anger, but understanding. "It was probably slipped into your things before he dropped you off." Tom swore under his breath. "That means they've had your coordinates since yesterday." Ethan smashed the tracker with the butt of his knife, sparks spitting across the rock. Then he turned to Clara. "We're not waiting for them to find us. We set the ground first." Tom's eyes hardened. "You've got a plan?" "Something like one," Ethan said, already pulling rope, wire, and flares from his pack. "We turn the hollow into a trap." They worked fast. Tom helped rig trip lines and makeshift alarms across the entrance, strings tied to tin cans linked to flares. Ethan set wire snares along the narrow path outside where the snow thinned. Ranger followed him every step, nose close to the ground, tail straight, his movements practiced and silent. When the wind shifted, it carried something new, the low hum of engines. Ethan froze. Through the snow's roar came the faint rhythm of snowmobiles. "They're close," he said quietly. Tom checked his rifle, eyes narrowing. 3 machines, maybe 4. Ethan turned to Clara. "You and Milo stay in the back of the cave. No matter what you hear, you don't move unless Ranger comes for you." She looked at him, lips trembling. "What about you?" He gave a small, tired smile. "I've been through worse storms." Ranger whined softly, brushing his muzzle against her knee before turning back toward Ethan, ready. Minutes later, the first figure appeared through the blizzard, a man dressed in white tactical gear, visor down, carrying an assault rifle across his chest. Behind him came 2 others, their movements precise, practiced. At their center was a taller figure, helmet removed, face hard and angular, framed by streaks of frostbitten stubble. His eyes were steel gray, cold and empty. Harwell. Ethan recognized him instantly, the ex-Special Forces soldier dishonorably discharged years ago for brutality. Once a man of principle, Harwell had become the kind who'd sell his skills to the highest bidder. His voice carried through the wind, sharp and calm. "Cole, I figured you'd come here." Ethan stepped out of the shadows near the cave mouth, rifle raised. "Didn't think you'd crawl this far north for pocket change." Harwell smirked. "Money's better than a conscience. Besides, your friend's father pays well for silence." "Silence," Ethan said, "comes cheap. You've forgotten what you used to stand for." Harwell's grin faded, replaced by something colder. "You talk about morals like they're rations, Cole. They run out eventually." Before he could answer, Ethan fired a warning shot, the bullet slicing snow inches from Harwell's boot. The mercenary scattered, taking cover behind boulders. Then came the first flash. Tom's tripwire. Flares erupted, painting the storm in red light. The wind screamed as fire streaked across the night. Ethan moved fast, years of training guiding every motion. He ducked behind a ledge, returned fire, controlled, efficient bursts. Ranger darted between rocks, barking to draw attention away from the cave. Clara crouched deeper inside, clutching Milo close, heart hammering in her throat. One mercenary charged from the left. Ethan threw a smoke grenade, filling the ravine with a dense white fog. Shots echoed, muffled. Harwell advanced through the haze, expression unreadable, like death wearing a man's face. Tom fired from a higher perch, his bullet striking one of the snowmobile's fuel tanks. The explosion tore through the storm, blinding light and fire roaring upward. The mercenary screamed, disappearing in the blaze. Ranger yelped, a sharp, painful sound. Ethan's eyes snapped toward him. The dog limped, paw streaked with blood, but he kept moving, nudging Milo and Clara deeper into the cave. Ethan's jaw clenched. "Stay down, boy," he whispered under his breath. Harwell's voice came through the smoke. "You can't win this, Cole. You were a soldier once. You know when the numbers don't add up." Ethan emerged from behind the rock, rifle hanging by its strap. I stopped counting when it was about survival. The 2 men closed the distance, the storm swirling around them like a living thing. Harwell swung first. Ethan blocked, their bodies crashing against the snow. The fight was brutal, primal, more about will than skill. Harwell's strength came from rage, Ethan's from purpose. "Still pretending you're the hero?" Harwell hissed, driving his elbow into Ethan's ribs. Ethan countered, slamming his forearm into Harwell's throat. Not pretending, just not you. They grappled near the cliff edge where the snow overhung the abyss. The wind shrieked, erasing all other sound. Then, with one final shove, Harwell lost his footing. His eyes widened, shock, not fear, before he vanished into the storm below. Ethan stood panting, watching the snow swallow him whole. There was no sound, no sign, just the endless white. He turned back, ribs aching, blood trickling from his lip. Ranger limped toward him, muzzle streaked with snow. Ethan knelt, pressing his forehead to the dog's. "You did good, partner." When they returned to the cave, Tom was crouched beside Clara, reloading his rifle. His beard was dusted with frost, eyes fierce and steady. "That all of them?" "For now," Ethan said. Clara looked up, tears glinting in her eyes as she touched Ranger's injured leg. "He saved us." Ethan nodded. "He always does." Outside, the storm began to fade, its fury spent. The fire crackled again, weak but alive. The four of them, 2 soldiers, 1 girl, 1 wounded dog, sat together in silence as snowflakes drifted through the entrance like falling ghosts. For the first time, Ethan allowed himself to believe they might actually see the dawn. By dawn, the mountain was silent again. The storm had passed, leaving the world remade in white. Every branch was glazed in ice, glittering under the newborn sun. Smoke curled gently from the mouth of the cave, where Ethan Cole sat with his back against the stone wall, exhaustion hollowing his face. His knuckles were raw, his ribs bruised, and yet he was alive. Ranger lay beside him, his right leg wrapped tightly with Tom's torn scarf. The dog's chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm. Each breath was a small victory. When Ethan reached out and brushed the fur between the shepherd's ears, Ranger opened one amber eye, tail flicking once, as if to say, "I'm still here." Clara knelt near the fire, her hair tangled and eyes rimmed red from sleeplessness. Her cheeks glowed faintly from the warmth of the flames. She'd spent the night cleaning Ranger's wound under Ethan's guidance, her hands trembling but steady. The puppy, Milo, slept pressed against her leg, his tiny body radiating comfort that words never could. Tom Whitaker crouched by the entrance, scanning the valley below through binoculars. His beard was heavy with frost, his breath curling from his lips like smoke. "They're gone," he said finally, lowering the lenses. No movement, no engines, just the snow. Ethan exhaled. "Harwell won't be coming back." Tom grunted. "If he did, the mountain would finish what you started." The wind outside had softened to a whisper. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Clara looked up, voice quiet, but clear. "What now?" Ethan turned the broken GPS tracker over in his hand. The red light had died hours ago. "Now," he said, "we end what your father started." 2 days later, they reached the nearest ranger outpost, a small cabin with a radio tower, 50 miles from civilization. It took most of a day to get a signal through the storm-damaged lines. When the dispatcher's voice finally crackled over the radio, Clara nearly cried. Ethan gave her a nod to speak, his hand resting on Ranger's collar. "This is Clara Bennett," she said, voice shaking. "I have evidence regarding Bennett Laboratories and multiple counts of animal cruelty and attempted murder." The next 72 hours blurred together. The helicopter rescue, the transport to Missoula, the questioning, the sleepless nights under sterile hospital lights. Clara watched her father's empire collapse in real time. Richard Bennett's arrest dominated the national news. The once untouchable CEO tall, sharp-featured, his silver hair always immaculate, was now led away in handcuffs, his face gaunt and unshaven. The charges were staggering: conspiracy, obstruction of justice, animal cruelty, and attempted homicide. Cameras captured him just once, eyes hollow as a man who had finally realized that all his power could not buy him back his humanity. Ethan watched the report from a hospital bed, his ribs bandaged, Ranger asleep at his feet. The screen flickered with the image of Clara outside the courthouse, her coat fluttering in the cold wind, her voice calm but fierce as she addressed reporters. "This isn't just about justice for me," she said. "It's about every living being that was treated like a thing instead of a soul." He couldn't help but smile. She'd come through fire and storm and still stood tall. Weeks passed. Winter slowly loosened its grip, the snow retreating to the mountaintops. Ethan and Clara stayed in the valley, helping with the investigation while recovering from their injuries. Tom returned to his solitary cabin in the woods, though he visited often with his dry humor and jars of homemade preserves he pretended not to be proud of. It was during one of those evenings, as the sun melted into the horizon, that Clara brought it up. "I don't want to leave this place," she said softly, watching the light dance over the trees. "Too much has been lost here, and too much has been found." Ethan glanced at her from where he sat repairing Ranger's training harness. "What are you thinking?" She hesitated, then smiled, a small, determined smile. "A sanctuary, a real one, for every animal that's been abandoned, hurt, or used, right here, on this land." He considered her words. The idea felt impossible and right all at once. "You want to build a rescue center in the middle of nowhere?" Clara's eyes gleamed. "Not nowhere. Here, the place that proved survival is possible." Ranger barked once as if casting his vote in favor. Milo yipped in agreement. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "Looks like I'm outnumbered." That spring, they built it. Haven Paw's sanctuary opened 3 months later on the site of Tom's old hunting grounds. Wooden cabins lined the clearing, fenced yards filled with dogs, and a small barn turned into an infirmary. Word spread fast. Volunteers came from nearby towns, drawn by the story of the Navy SEAL and the woman who defied her father's cruelty. Ranger, healed but limping slightly, became a symbol of resilience. Milo grew fast, lanky, and bright-eyed, always at Ranger's side like a shadow. The media called them the Soldiers of Compassion, and though Ethan hated attention, he couldn't deny the name fit. One visitor, a middle-aged journalist named Sarah Callan, arrived one afternoon to write an article for a national magazine. She was in her 40s, tall and slender, with auburn hair tied back and a streak of silver at her temple that gave her a distinguished air. Her eyes were sharp and kind, the kind that saw stories hidden beneath silence. She spent hours talking to Clara and filming Ranger and Milo playing in the fields. Before she left, she said softly to Ethan, "You think you saved them, but maybe they saved you too." He didn't argue. By summer, Haven Paws thrived. Children from nearby schools visited weekly, learning about rescue work and empathy. Clara taught them how to feed and groom the animals, her laughter echoing across the valley. Ethan, though quieter, found peace in rebuilding fences, training rescue dogs, and teaching the local rangers how to handle K-9 units. His hands were still scarred, his past still heavy, but for the first time, the weight didn't feel like punishment. It felt like purpose. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the Navy. Inside was an invitation, a request for Ethan Cole to return as a consultant, training young SEAL recruits in K-9 operations. He stared at the seal embossed on the paper for a long time. Clara found him outside, letter in hand. "Are you going back?" she asked. He looked toward Ranger lying in the grass beside Milo. The older dog raised his head, watching him with those amber eyes that had seen too much and still believed. Ethan smiled faintly. "Just to teach. The rest of me stays here." That evening, he stood before the recruits at a naval base training ground, the sun bleeding gold across the ocean. Ranger trotted beside him, older now, but proud. Ethan's voice carried firm and low. "A good handler doesn't command loyalty, he earns it. Remember that. A dog's faith isn't in your rank, it's in your heart." The applause that followed was quiet, respectful. Months later, winter came again, but this time it brought peace instead of fear. The valley glowed under the low sun, every flake of snow shimmering. Haven Paws was full, rescued huskies, shepherds, mutts of all kinds. Clara stood on the porch of the main lodge, scarf fluttering in the breeze. Ethan joined her, his coat dusted with snow, Ranger at his side, Milo bounding through the drifts. They watched as the two dogs raced together, one old soldier, one young recruit, chasing nothing but light. Clara smiled, her eyes bright. "You once said loyalty doesn't need an oath. Now I believe it only needs a heart." Ethan glanced at her, a rare warmth softening his features. "And sometimes," he said quietly, "miracles begin with a bark." Ranger barked just then, sharp and joyous, as if answering. The sun sank behind the mountains, bathing the valley in a golden glow. For the first time, the world felt whole again. Every storm leaves behind two things: scars and seeds. What we choose to nurture decides who we become. Light after the storm isn't just about a soldier, a woman, and two dogs. It's about the strength that lives in all of us to turn pain into compassion and fear into purpose. In our everyday lives, we meet storms of our own, loss, failure, loneliness. Yet, just like Ethan, Clara, Ranger, and little Milo, we can choose to rebuild, to care, to love again. Maybe your act of kindness today becomes someone else's miracle tomorrow. Tell us in the comments, what was your favorite moment in this story, and how has loyalty or compassion changed your life? Share this video if you believe love and courage can heal the world. Subscribe to our channel to join more stories of hope, loyalty, and second chances, because sometimes miracles really do begin with a bark.